Today we are honored to have Mr. James Crabtree, a leading authority in geopolitics. As an analyst and author with extensive experience in Asia, he is a distinguished visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, a visiting fellow at the Asia Society in New York, and a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine. Against the backdrop of the Asia-Pacific landscape undergoing profound changes, we will explore several key questions with Mr. Crabtree, and we anticipate his insightful perspectives. Given the recent escalation of global trade tensions initiated by the Trump administration's tariff policies, how would you assess the evolution of U.S. domestic and foreign policy orientation in the post-Trump era? Within this context, what is your perspective on the potential trajectory of Sino-American relations regarding economic cooperation and strategic competition?
So I think I have some sympathy with people here in Beijing in trying to understand what is going on in Washington, because it is very confusing. I think you have, with the tariffs, you have a basic insight, which is President Trump likes tariffs, and he thinks that they achieve a number of objectives. So they raise money, they help to reshore manufacturing, and they help to correct the trade imbalance between the United States and China. Empirically, that's not true, but he believes that it's true, and therefore he's using tariffs as this magic public policy to solve all of these problems. He also is a believer in escalation, and therefore he's using the tariffs to as a negotiating tool to seek to do deals with a range of countries, including China, but not exclusively China. Some countries are allies, like Japan or the United Kingdom. Some are close partners, like India, and some are strategic rivals, like China. And so he is using the tariffs to force people to negotiate. And in most cases, that has been, the effect of the tariffs has been disastrous macroeconomically, but in terms of forcing countries to come to the United States to seek a deal, it's been reasonably successful. And so there are now negotiations ongoing with many US partners, Japan, India, the United Kingdom, the European Union, that will probably result in some kind of deal where the United States will lower tariffs in exchange for arrangements that the US perceives to be beneficial. China is unusual because China is the only country which has so far refused to come to the negotiating table and has matched the United States tariff policy. So the problem that we currently have is that both sides, the United States and China, would like there to be a deal. But at the moment, they're finding it very difficult to talk to one another because neither side wants to appear to be weak. And that is because of the wider context of geostrategic competition and the rivalry between the two great powers. Therefore, you asked me about the future trajectory of US-China relations. I think in the short term, it's quite difficult because firstly, there are no communication channels at a senior level currently between the United States and China that we know about. Secondly, you have a very different style of negotiation where President Trump sees negotiation as the beginning of a process, a meeting between himself and President Xi, and for China that has to be the end of the process. So there has to be a low-level negotiation to set the terms, and that isn't happening at the moment. And then both sides are escalating, generally, so we've seen this escalation. So I think in the short term, maybe what will happen is that there will be a pause, and nothing very much will happen, and the United States will negotiate with the other countries, and China will wait for a while. And then at some point, a channel will open up, and you will begin to have preparations for a conversation between the two leaders that will result in some kind of arrangement that will see the tariff levels fall. That's what I think is most likely to happen, but I think the coming period, the next weeks and months, could be quite bumpy.
Given the escalating trade tensions between China and the United States, There has been substantial discourse among policymakers and academia regarding the prospect of Sino-US decoupling. As in an analytical perspective, how would you assess the evolving dynamics of this economic relationship? Furthermore, should a decoupling scenario materialize in the economic and trade realms, what would be the potential ramifications for the global economic order and international supply chains?
So presently, we are heading on a path to total decoupling, as in we are with the tariffs at their current level where we are speaking today, it is not possible to have trade between the United States and China. But in a sense, that's not the only way in which the countries are linked. So there are other forms of, educational exchanges, technological exchanges, capital flows. But in terms of trade, if tariffs are anywhere near this level, then US-China trade will be zero. So we do face a very different scenario. If you compare the United States and China and Europe and China, the biggest trading blocs, Europe is interested in strategic decoupling in particular areas. So there are some areas where Europeans think, on balance, we think that there are risks associated with trading with China, and therefore we don't want to do that. But there are other areas where we're perfectly happy. So let's say telecoms infrastructure we might be worried about for security issues, but we're perfectly happy to trade in other areas. In the United States, there's a different discussion with these tariffs where it's going to be a much broader form of decoupling. And I suppose the question is it possible to negotiate tariffs to a level where some forms of trade are still possible? So, for instance, the United States has already admitted that it doesn't want to decouple in consumer electronics because they've removed the tariffs, and that's 25% of trade because, in a sense, Americans like buying phones, and phones are made in China. So, to be honest with you, I think the process that the United States is going through is much less strategic than one would hope. As in, under the Biden administration team were quite strategic in identifying areas where they thought it was important for the United States to decouple, the most obvious being semiconductors and artificial intelligence. So they called it the small yard and the high fence. So there was going to be a small area of the economy which they wanted to protect, and they'd put a high fence around it. Under this administration, the yard is obviously much larger, so the area that they're thinking about protecting is much larger. But I also think that they haven't thought through in a coherent way what it is that they're trying to achieve, hence all of the chaos that's going on at the moment and the back and forth. And I think if there is a form of broad decoupling between the United States and China, then in a sense you're asking me, does that make the broader bilateral relationship better or worse? And I think it's a very complicated question to answer, because in some ways we tend to think that trade interlinkages are important to keep, peaceful relations between countries, because trade is valuable, and therefore if you trade with one another you have a reason to talk to each other. On the other hand, I'm not sure how you translate this into Mandarin, but in English you have a phrase which says good fences make good neighbors, as in if you have barriers, then actually it can lead to positive relations because there are fewer tensions. So one of the problems when you have these strong trade interlinkages is that they can be weaponized. China can decide to stop exporting rare earths, or the United States can stop exporting chips. So actually there's another case which might say fewer trade interlinkages might lead to a reduction of tensions in one form or another. And I think we don't really know how that would change, but it would be a very significant change in the structure of globalization. In a sense, you would have America withdrawing from the globalized world, and therefore you would have a globalized world with really two major engines, which would be Europe and Northeast Asia, as opposed to three. And that would create a big change in the sort of geoeconomic power balance in the world, where America would become more isolationist. And I think we simply don't know how far the United States is going to go. You know, it is conceivable that we could go back. You know, I think the 10% tariffs that Trump has put up will stay whatever happens. I mean, I think we're not going to get rid of those. But there's a big difference between a world where you have this 10% tariff on everyone, pretty much, and then that's about it, or ones in which the tariffs on certain countries are much, much higher, including China. And I think at the moment it's quite difficult to tell where we're going to end up.
In light of apparent transatlantic policy divergence under the Trump presidency, how would you evaluate the current strategic recalibration in EU-China engagement? Do you perceive this as indicative of a potential long-term reorientation in Europe's geopolitical focus towards enhanced Asian partnerships?
So, yes, the major change that has happened since the Trump administration is not between the United States and China, it is between the United States and Europe. And so the Americans have signaled very clearly a new direction with respect to Europe, which is to withdraw to some degree from its commitments, security commitments in Europe. We don't yet know how full that withdrawal will be. So within Europe, there are some who hope that there will be, in a sense, a small withdrawal, but the United States will stay, despite all of the rhetoric. And there are some who fear that the United States will leave entirely. And at the moment, we're trying to work out where that will be. That has enormous strategic implications in the long term, but in the short term it also has clear implications for the resolution of the Ukraine war, because the ability to strike a Ukraine peace accord is it's much easier to do that if the United States is involved, not simply in the negotiations, but in the final peace deal, providing some measure of security guarantees. But in the long term, it's clear that Europe is going to have to pay for more of its own security, rearm militarily, and in a sense become a more normal global power, which is not simply an economic power, but is also a military power. Now, you asked two questions. One is, what implications does that have for China, and what implications does that have for Asia more broadly? And the second is much simpler to answer, which is Europe is very keen now to develop much stronger partnerships with Asian partners, Japan, Korea, Australia, and particularly India. So lots of energy and focus on developing partnerships with other either advanced industrialized countries in Asia like Japan or emerging democracies like India. I think the question on China is much more complicated. So over the last decade, Europe has shifted from seeing China largely as an economic partner to seeing it as a strategic competitor. And that's partly because of Chinese policies, but there are two in particular that have been very damaging to China-Europe relations. The first is Ukraine, where Europeans perceive China to be fully supporting Russia's war effort, and they think that if China didn't support Russia, then it would be much more difficult for Russia to prosecute the war. And the second of which is the economic change that China introduced after COVID, as it rebalanced its economy away from investment in property and infrastructure and towards investment in advanced manufacturing. And so people call the effect of this was to vastly increase the volume of China's high-tech manufacturing, to move it up the value chain, which from China's perspective is entirely sensible. But if you're sitting in Europe and also in some parts of the global south, you look at the enormous power of China's exporters and you think you're going to get wiped out. So if you're a German car maker or a Malaysian factory owner or an Indonesian textile maker, this change in the Chinese economy is immensely threatening. And all of these countries think that China doesn't play fair in the way that it subsidizes its economy. That's a different argument. But anyway, so the challenge for China-Europe relations is that in order to imagine a better future in which there is more cooperation, A, one precondition would be for China to stop being as supportive of Russia, which I don't think is going to happen. And the other is to imagine a future in which the structure of China's economy changes quickly, which is very difficult to do. And so I do think that Europe is open to a conversation at the moment to improve relations with China. And actually yesterday, on the day that we're recording, the day before, China signaled that it would remove some of the sanctions that it put on European politicians. So China had sanctioned members of the European Parliament in a way that was diplomatically very counterproductive. And China has signaled that it will row back on that, I think, as a gesture of good faith, that it is serious about trying to mend bridges with Europe. But I still think these two structural problems, Ukraine and the Chinese economic model, make it very difficult for Europe to seriously consider a much stronger partnership, and will continue to view China as a competitor until, in a sense, something changes in those areas. So I think maybe modest improvements in European-China relations, but it's hard to imagine dramatic improvements at the moment.
Okay. Regarding the intensifying technological rivalry between China and the United States, particularly in frontier fields such as artificial intelligence exemplified by innovations like ChatGPT and DeepSeek, how would you characterize the current phase of this competition? What key factors might determine its future developmental trajectory within the global innovation ecosystem?
So it's been very interesting being here in China this week. I've been here this week, not here at Beida, but at Tsinghua over the road. And it's clear that the launch of DeepSeek has really seen China's leaders regain confidence in their relative technological position on artificial intelligence. If you go back a little bit, you think about China's technological leadership. There was a period in which it appeared in many domains that China was more advanced than the United States, certainly more cost competitive in telecoms, in electronic vehicles. But the advance of artificial intelligence, in a sense, tilted that back to the United States, because suddenly everybody realized that AI was not just a technology, it was overwhelmingly the most important of these frontier technologies. And the United States had a clear lead, 1 to 2 years in advance of the Chinese models. And that had also, sitting here in the School of International Studies at Beida, that had all sorts of geopolitical implications, because suddenly countries that wanted to have advanced technology, which might previously have looked at China as the leader in the field, certainly the cheaper option, but often the better option as well. If you're looking for telecom equipment, Chinese equipment is not only cheaper but better than the competition. But now in the world of artificial intelligence, the American offer was much better. True also in cloud computing and a few other areas. So I think DeepSeek has big implications, because it's not just that it now looks as if China can develop models that are as good probably as some of the American models, and in some ways technologically less expensive. But that will also then have geopolitical implications in terms of the way that countries look at the relative importance of their partnerships with China and the United States. Now, what happens next? So under the Biden administration, you had 2 rounds of restrictions in which the United States tried to stop the export of advanced semiconductor chips of the kind that you need to train AI models. And I think they will continue to tighten up these rules. So they brought in rules at the turn of the year, which are called the AI diffusion rules, which stop third countries, are meant to stop third countries from buying chips and then selling them to China. And then we've just seen new rules to restrict access to a special chip called the H20, which NVIDIA made specifically for Chinese customers. So it was one that, in a sense, was allowed within the US rules, and then they decided that it wasn't allowed. So I think they'll continue to tighten this up. And I think, in a sense, DeepSeek has merely, it has seen China's confidence in its own abilities return, but it has also renewed the competitive instinct. As in the United States, there was a debate, as in, do we have to develop the most advanced models, or should we also be thinking about AI safety, things like that. And I think under President Trump, nobody cares about AI safety anymore. They only care about winning the AI race, and the only two real participants in that race are the United States and China. So I think you will see an intensification of the investment in AI models, probably on both sides, as in both sides are still pouring money into this. And you will see an intensification of efforts by the United States to use regulation to gain an advantage in this race. And where this will end up, who can tell?
In your new book, The Perimeter, the inside story of the struggle to save American primacy in the Pacific and the world, the core focus revolves around the loss of American primacy. Could you share with us more details?
For the last 10 or 15 years, it has been engaged in a process that I would describe as the reinforcement of its perimeter. Under the latter Obama administration, under the first Trump administration, under President Biden. Now I think there's a genuine debate, albeit at an early stage in Washington, about the extent to which that strategy is viable in the long term. You have seen the Americans begin a process of withdrawing from Europe. And now the question is, are they going to use the resources that they save in Europe to focus on China, reinforcing the forward perimeter, or are they going to, in a sense, step back and reassess their role in the Indo-Pacific? And I think we don't know where that debate is going to land, but it's a very consequential strategic decision that the United States has to make as to whether it is willing to bear the costs associated with continuing to be a dominant or powerful player in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I think the age, what international relations scholars call the age of primacy, is now over. The US no longer has that position of being the overwhelmingly dominant power, particularly in this part of the world where China's military capability has transformed over the last 2 or 3 decades to the point where the US no longer enjoys the dominant position that it used to have, but it's still a very powerful player, the world's most powerful military, its largest economy. It's still the dominant country in the world, but it's reaching a stage of its trajectory as a great power in which it now realizes it's difficult for it to sustain a truly global presence, and that's why it's withdrawing from Europe to some degree. And it also faces in China a very determined peer competitor that would like to be itself a more dominant player in East Asia, and therefore you have the tension that will be the central geopolitical fault line for the coming decades, and so that's what the book looks at.